In the Empire of Valdren, your bloodline was everything. Not in the way that people said it casually, the way you might say reputation is everything or hard work is everything, meaning it matters a great deal and you should take it seriously. In Valdren, bloodline was everything in the literal and complete sense of the word. It determined where you lived. It determined what you could build. It determined who would stand beside you and who would walk past you without acknowledging you were there. The noble houses had built the entire architecture of the empire around the principle that bloodline ability was the accurate and final measure of a person's worth, and they had been building on that principle for long enough that most people inside the empire had stopped being able to imagine a different foundation. Cale Dravon had been living inside that architecture his entire life. He was 20 years old. Second son of a minor noble house that had enough standing to be invited to imperial functions but not enough standing to matter at them. His older brother had awakened a solid combat bloodline at 16, the standard age, and had been absorbed into the imperial military structure with the smooth efficiency of a system receiving exactly what it was designed to receive. His younger sister had awakened at 15 with an ability the family had not seen in 2 generations, something rare enough that the major noble houses had started sending envoys to the Dreven estate within a month of the awakening. Cale had not awakened. Not at 16. Not at 17. Not at 18 or 19. The ability assessors the family had brought in had run their evaluations 4 separate times over 4 years and each time the result was the same. Bloodline present. Bloodline dormant. No activation pathway currently detectable. The 4th assessor had added, with the specific kindness of someone delivering news they had delivered many times and had learned to soften without changing, that some bloodlines simply did not awaken. That this was not a failure of character or effort. That there were productive lives available outside the ability framework. His father had thanked the assessor and shown him out and had not spoken to Cale about it afterward. The silence was its own communication. Cale had spent the 2 years since the 4th assessment doing what he had always done when the official frameworks did not have a category for him. He observed. He learned that he read everything the family library had that was relevant to territory management, resource development, agriculture, construction, the practical mechanics of how land became a functioning domain rather than just a piece of geography with a noble's name attached to it. He had not been preparing for anything specific. He had been preparing because preparation was the thing available to him when ability was not, and he was not the kind of person who sat still in the absence of a clear path forward. The noble council summons had arrived on a Tuesday. He had been in the library when the courier came. The summons was formal, embossed with the council's seal, addressed to him specifically rather than to his father, which was the first unusual thing about it. Minor noble second sons without awakened bloodlines did not receive individual summons from the imperial council. They received, at most, inclusion in family communications addressed to the house head. He had gone. The council chamber was in the imperial administrative complex, a building designed to make everyone who entered it understand immediately and continuously that they were in the presence of institutional power that had been accumulating for a very long time. The ceilings were high and the stone was old and the light came in through narrow windows at angles that seemed calculated to fall on the council members' chairs rather than on the chairs of the people being addressed. 7 council members in formal robes, clerks at the edges of the room. A single chair positioned in front of the council table that was designed, Cale noted as he sat in it, to be slightly lower than the council member's eye level. He sat in it. The council member who spoke first was Lord Heron, the most senior of the 7, a man in his late 60s with the specific quality of someone who had held significant institutional power for long enough that the holding of it had become indistinguishable from his personality. He spoke with the warmth of someone performing warmth rather than feeling it, which was a distinction Cale had learned to make early and had never stopped finding useful. Lord Heron said the council had been reviewing the status of frontier territories within the Empire's administrative boundaries. He said there were several territories in the outer regions that had been classified as unmanaged due to the absence of viable pioneer settlements. He said it was the council's responsibility to ensure that imperial territory was actively administered rather than left to deteriorate. He said the council had identified a territory in the northeastern frontier region that was in particular need of a pioneer administrator and had determined that Cale Dravon, given his demonstrated interest in territory management and resource development, was an excellent candidate for the assignment. He said all of this with the warmth of someone offering a gift. Cale listened to all of it with the attention of someone reading the gap between what was being said and what was actually happening. That he asked, politely and with the specific quality of someone genuinely seeking information rather than registering an objection, what the territory's current classification was. Lord Heron said it was classified as a contested frontier zone. Cale asked what the monster activity level was in the territory. A brief pause. Another council member, Lord Varys, said the territory had elevated monster presence consistent with its frontier classification, but that pioneer settlements in contested zones were supported by the council's Frontier Development Charter. Cale asked about the condition of the soil and water. Lord Heron said the territory's natural resources were undeveloped and represented significant potential for an administrator with vision and initiative. Cale looked at the council members one at a time. Not with anger. With the specific attention of someone filing information. He said he would accept the assignment. Lord Heron's warmth became slightly more genuine for a moment, the involuntary warmth of someone who had been prepared for resistance and had not needed to deploy the arguments they had prepared. He said the council was pleased with Cale's decision and that the formal pioneer certificate and territory deed would be prepared and delivered to the Dreven estate within the week. Cale thanked the council and left the chamber. In the corridor outside he walked at the same pace he always walked and let the full picture of what had just happened settle into clarity as he moved. He had been in the family library long enough and had read enough historical administrative records to know what contested frontier zone with elevated monster presence and undeveloped natural resources actually meant when a council of imperial nobles said it with that specific quality of warmth. It meant the territory was a wasteland. It meant previous settlement attempts had failed. It meant the monster activity was not elevated in the way that challenging but manageable territories were elevated, but in the way that had made every previous attempt to establish a permanent presence there end badly. It meant they were sending him somewhere designed to fail. He walked home through the Imperial Administrative District and thought about this, that he had two options. He could understand this as what it appeared to be on the surface, an opportunity framed as a gift that was actually a disposal, a way for the council to remove a dormant bloodline's second son from the Empire's social landscape without the awkwardness of doing it directly. Or he could understand it as what it actually was, which was the same thing, but with the additional recognition that the territory was real and the pioneer certificate was legally binding and the land, whatever its current condition, was now his. A piece of land that was currently killing everyone who tried to settle it was, in the hands of someone the original owners had not anticipated, a different kind of problem than they had designed for. He got home and went back to the library and spent the next week reading everything he could find about the northeastern frontier territories before the pioneer certificate arrived. What he found was not reassuring in the conventional sense. The territory had been attempted 6 times in the past 200 years. None of the attempts had produced a lasting settlement. The most recent attempt, 40 years ago, had ended with the entire pioneer group either killed or fled within the first 3 months. The monster activity in the region was described in the historical records as extreme rather than elevated, a distinction that the council's language had carefully avoided. The soil was described as corrupted, which in the Empire's agricultural terminology meant land that had been affected by concentrated monster presence for long enough that the corruption had become a property of the soil itself rather than just a condition of the surface. Corrupted soil did not grow things. He read this and thought about what he knew about corruption in the land and what caused it and what, in the recorded historical cases, had ever reversed it. The records were not optimistic. Corruption reversal was considered a function of light element abilities at very high development levels or of nature element abilities at similar levels, neither of which he had. He also found something that the records mentioned briefly and without elaboration, a reference in the oldest document he could locate about the territory, a survey conducted approximately 230 years ago before the corruption had fully established itself. The survey described the territory as a region of unusual geological activity and noted the presence of what the surveyor called deep vein formations of unknown mineral composition that he had not been able to properly assess due to time constraints. Unknown mineral composition. Deep vein formations. Noted briefly and then never followed up in any subsequent document. He read that twice. He packed carefully. His group was small. He had not been able to recruit extensively, because the territory's reputation was known and because his own standing in the Empire's ability hierarchy made him not the kind of leader that experienced people with options were looking for. He had his 2 assigned guardian knights, older men named Soren and Bram who had been attached to the Dreven estate for years and who had the specific loyalty of people who had decided that following through on a commitment was more important than the circumstances the commitment had led them into. He had 8 soldiers, young men who had not yet found stable positions in established military structures and who were willing to take uncertain prospects in a frontier territory over no prospects in the capital. He had 12 settlers, families, and individuals from the overtaxed lower districts of the imperial city who had been given the choice of a difficult frontier or a deteriorating life in the city and had chosen the frontier with the pragmatic reasoning of people who understood that their current situation was also a kind of dying, just a slower one. 23 people total. He looked at them assembled in the morning light outside the eastern gate of the imperial city, their carts loaded with tools and seeds and the materials he had spent the week selecting with the specific care of someone who understood that what he chose to bring was going to be the difference between starting with something and starting with nothing. Soren said quietly beside him that it was not too late to go back to the council and decline. Kale said he knew. Soren said the territory's record was not good. Kale said he knew that too. Soren looked at him with the expression of someone who had been waiting for a different response and had decided to accept the one they had received. He said, then let's move. They moved. The journey to the northeastern frontier took 11 days. The landscape changed as they went, the organized agricultural territories of the Empire's interior giving way gradually to less managed land, then to land that the Empire's administrative reach clearly did not extend to, then to the specific quality of terrain that had been shaped by extended monster presence, the vegetation thinning and the vegetation that remained taking on the particular look of things that had been growing in conditions that were not designed for growing. The road deteriorated. The sky had a quality to it in the last 2 days of travel that Kale could not precisely identify but that the settlers in the group were responding to with a tightening of posture and an increase in the frequency with which people checked the surrounding terrain while they walked. They reached the territory boundary on the afternoon of the 11th day. The boundary was marked by a series of old stone posts that had been placed by one of the earlier settlement attempts and had never been removed because there had been no one with authority over the territory to remove them. Beyond the posts the terrain was immediately different. Not dramatically. Not in the way that a clear line divided 2 entirely different environments. More like stepping from a room where the air was acceptable into a room where the air was slightly wrong in a way you could feel before you could name it. The soil on the near side of the boundary was pale and dry in the way of land that had not been worked recently but still retained the basic structural properties of soil. On the far side the soil had a different quality, darker in a way that was not the dark of rich earth but the dark of something that had absorbed something it should not have absorbed, a color that the eye registered and then moved away from slightly, as if looking directly at it for too long was mildly uncomfortable. Corrupted soil, the records had been accurate. Kale crossed the boundary without stopping and the group followed because he crossed without stopping and that was the thing about moving first. It made the decision for everyone behind you without requiring any of them to make it individually. They found the ruins of the most recent settlement attempt in the late afternoon. Not much remained. The wooden structures had collapsed or been destroyed. The stone foundations were intact because stone did not care about the things that had ended the settlement. Some of the stones had marks on them that were not natural wear, the marks of something that had pushed or struck them with enough force to leave impressions in the material. Kale looked at the marks and then looked at the surrounding terrain. He selected a position 200 meters from the ruins, slightly elevated, with a natural rock formation on the western side that would serve as one wall of the initial camp structure without requiring construction. He directed the soldiers to begin setting the camp perimeter. He directed Soren and Bram to assess the defensive angles of the position. He directed the settlers to begin the camp construction in the order he had planned during the journey, the specific sequence that would get the most critical structures up before dark, that he worked alongside them. That was the first thing they noticed about him, the settlers especially. He did not direct from a position of distance. He was in the work with them, lifting what needed to be lifted, solving the problems that came up in real time, making the decisions that needed to be made without creating the delays that indecision produced. He had no bloodline ability to demonstrate. What he had instead was competence, visible and consistent, and in a group of people who were afraid and in an unfamiliar place, competence was the thing that was closest to reassurance. The camp was not finished when the sun went down. It did not need to be finished. It needed to be functional and defensible, and it was both. The monsters came 2 hours after dark. Not immediately and not all at once. That was the first thing Kale noted about the attack pattern. There was a period of silence after sunset that was longer than it should have been, the specific silence of an environment in which the smaller creatures that normally filled the night sounds were absent, which meant something larger than the things they were afraid of was in the area. Then at the 2-hour mark the silence broke. They came from the eastern approach. 4 of them, roughly human-sized but moving in the way that things moved when the architecture of their movement had been designed for something other than the terrain they were currently crossing. Fast and low and coming in a spread formation that was either instinctual or coordinated, and the distinction between instinctual and coordinated in a monster attack was not academic because coordinated attacks adapted and instinctual ones did not. Soren and Bram were already positioned. Soren had 30 years of combat experience and the specific quality of a man who had been in difficult situations often enough that difficult situations did not change his baseline processing speed. Bram was younger and faster and positioned on the left flank where the approach angle made speed more useful than experience. The 8 soldiers held the perimeter in the formation Kale had briefed them on during the journey, the formation designed for a small defensive group that needed to cover the maximum perimeter with the minimum personnel. Kale was in the center. He had a standard combat blade, which he was competent with but not exceptional, and the knowledge that he had no bloodline ability to supplement the blade and that this might have been was the only productive approach. The first monster came through the eastern approach at speed and Bram intercepted it with the efficiency of someone who had done this before. The second came through a slightly different angle and one of the soldiers took it, not cleanly but effectively, the kind of engagement that cost something but produced the result that mattered. The third came through the center and Kale moved to meet it. The fight was not elegant. He was not an exceptional fighter. He was a prepared fighter, which was a different thing. He knew the principles of the engagement, the positioning, the weight distribution, the angles, and he applied them with the consistency of someone who had studied them carefully and practiced them within his limits. The monster was faster than him and stronger than him and the engagement cost him a gash along his left forearm before it was finished, but it was finished. The fourth came from the north flank, outside the primary defensive formation, and 2 of the settlers who had military backgrounds in their histories and had been positioned at the north perimeter engaged it together with the coordinated efficiency of people who had decided that being afraid was less useful than being effective. The 4th monster went down. Silence returned. Kale stood in the center of the camp with blood running down his left arm and looked at the 4 bodies in the darkness around the perimeter and thought about the attack pattern. For monsters in a spread formation with one coming from outside the primary approach angle. Not fully random. Not fully coordinated. Somewhere between the two, which suggested the territory's monster population had some degree of collective behavioral organization without having the kind of intelligence that produced true tactical coordination. Useful information. He said to the group, clearly and without urgency, that the perimeter held and they should check for injuries and then return to the camp tasks because the night was not finished and neither was the work. People checked for injuries. Several minor wounds, nothing serious. They returned to the camp tasks. Soren came to stand beside Kale while Bram organized the wound treatment. He said that had gone better than it might have. Kale said yes. Soren said it was also going to happen again tonight and probably several more times before morning. Kale said yes. Soren said he wanted to ask Kale something directly. Kale said go ahead. Soren said he had followed orders and kept his commitments for 30 years and had never once questioned a decision that the person he was assigned to made because that was not his function. But standing in the middle of this territory in the dark with monster bodies around the perimeter, he wanted to know, not as a challenge but as a genuine question from a man who had a right to know what he had committed himself to, whether Kale had a plan or whether they were here because there was nowhere else to be. Kale looked at him. He said there was a plan. He said he did not know yet if the plan was going to work because the plan depended on something he had not been able to verify before arriving, something the historical records had suggested was possible but had not confirmed. He said the plan was not based on his bloodline ability because as Soren was aware his bloodline had not awakened and he was not going to build a plan on an ability he did not have. He said the plan was based on what he had been able to read about the territory and what he believed was possible if they could hold the perimeter long enough to test his understanding of the situation. Soren was quiet for a moment. He said that was either a very honest answer or a very sophisticated way of saying no. Kale said he thought it was honest. Soren looked at the dark territory around them and then looked back at Kale. He said he had spent 30 years following men who had bloodline abilities and institutional standing and all the markers the Empire used to indicate that someone was worth following. He said most of them had been less honest than the answer he had just received. He said he would hold the perimeter. He went back to his position. The monsters came twice more before morning. The second attack was larger, 6, and the engagement was harder and cost them more, but the perimeter held. The third was 2 large ones that came from opposite sides simultaneously, which was the closest thing to actual tactical coordination Kale had seen and which he noted carefully because the ability to learn from a response was more dangerous in a sustained engagement than raw numbers. When the sun came up they were all still there. Tired and marked by the night but present and functional and standing in a corrupted wasteland that the Imperial Council had awarded to a man with no bloodline ability as a polite way of removing him from the Empire's social landscape. Kale walked the perimeter with the morning light and looked at what the night had produced. 4 monster bodies from the first attack. 6 from the second. 2 large ones from the third. 12 total. Each of them had left behind what the Empire's hunting and ability records called a monster core, the compressed residue of the monster's ability energy that accumulated at the creature's center mass during its lifetime and did not dissolve with the body. Monster cores were resources. The Empire's hunters collected them. They powered certain kinds of ability development. They had market value. 12 cores from a single night in a territory that had been abandoned for 40 years was not a comfortable night's work, but it was a productive one in a specific and measurable way. He collected the cores. He was not sure why he collected them personally rather than directing one of the soldiers to do it. He had been directing everything else. There was something about the cores specifically that made him want to handle them himself, a preference he did not have a rational explanation for but that he followed because he had learned over 20 years that his preferences were worth following even when the reason for them was not immediately clear. He held the first core in his left hand, the hand with the bandaged gash from the first engagement, and looked at it in the morning light. It was roughly the size of his fist, dense and slightly warm, a dark color that had the same quality as the corrupted soil but concentrated, intensified, the way a reduction of something was more itself than the original. It had a weight to it that was inconsistent with its size, heavier than the visual suggested, as if what was inside it occupied more space than the outside indicated. He turned it in his hand. And something in his chest moved. Not pain. Not discomfort. The specific sensation of something that had been still for a very long time beginning to move, the way a mechanism that has been locked in one position feels when the lock is finally released and the mechanism discovers that it was always designed to move in a different direction than the locked position allowed. A warmth that started in his chest and moved outward through his body and arrived in his left hand simultaneously from the inside. The core in his hand pulsed once. Then it dissolved. Not crumbled. Not broke apart. Dissolved, The way something dissolves when it has been absorbed rather than when it has been destroyed, leaving behind no residue, no fragment, nothing that indicated it had been there at all. Cale stared at his empty hand. The warmth was still moving through him, different now that the core had dissolved, more distributed, less concentrated, the way heat distributed through a material after the source of the heat had been removed. He felt it settle into his body, not uncomfortably, not as an external presence but as something that had been incorporated, that was now internal rather than separate. His status, the bloodline status that the assessors had checked 4 times over 4 years and found dormant each time, shifted. He felt it shift the way you feel a change in pressure, not seeing it or hearing it but registering it through the body's own sense of itself. Something that had been closed had opened. Not fully. Not dramatically. The smallest possible increment of opening, a door that had been sealed for 20 years cracking by the width of a finger. And through that crack, the faintest reading of the system that lived underneath the dormant classification. He read what it showed him. The words appeared in his understanding the way ability information always appeared for people with awakened bloodlines, not on a surface he was looking at but in a layer of awareness that was simultaneous with his normal perception, present without being intrusive. Bloodline, Terra vein. Classification, territory conversion. Function, absorbs monster ability residue through direct core contact or proximity conversion of territory-based monster kills. Converts absorbed residue into territory restoration energy. Range, currently 5 meters from bloodline holder. Effect, progressive corruption removal, mineral unlocking, soil restoration, water purification within active range. Secondary function, locked. Unlocking condition, bloodline advancement threshold not yet reached. Note, Terravane bloodline absorbs 20% of all monster kills performed by individuals within the holder's recognized territory in addition to direct core contact. Territory recognition range, currently 5 meters. He read it twice. He looked up from his empty hand at the corrupted wasteland surrounding the camp, the dark wrong-colored soil, the dead vegetation, the air that had the slightly off quality that had been present since they crossed the boundary. He looked at the ground directly around him. Within 5 meters of where he was standing, the soil was different. Not dramatically. Not in a way that would have been visible from a distance. A slight change in the color, a fraction less of the wrong darkness, a fraction more of the pale dry but neutral color of the soil on the other side of the boundary. The change was the width of a perception, something you would have to be looking for to see, something you would dismiss as a trick of the morning light if you did not already know what you were looking for. He was looking for it. He crouched down and touched the soil within the 5-meter radius. It was different under his fingers. Not restored. Not the rich texture of worked agricultural land. But different from the corrupted soil 2 meters outside the radius, different in the specific way of something that had taken a step away from what it had been rather than a step toward what it could become. A step was enough. He stood up and held the second core. It dissolved in his hand the same way the first had, and the warmth moved through him again, and the radius around him shifted by the smallest measurable degree, and the soil within that radius shifted with it. He held all 12 cores. All 12 dissolved. He stood in the middle of the corrupted wasteland with an awakened bloodline that the Imperial Council's assessors had classified as dormant for 4 years and looked at the circle of slightly less corrupted soil around him and thought about the territory assessment the Council had done before awarding it to him. They had assessed the territory's condition and determined that it was essentially worthless. They had been assessing for the things that made territories valuable to people with the abilities the Empire had catalogued and understood. They had not been assessing for what the territory would look like if the person assigned to it had an ability that had never appeared in the Empire's ability records before. Terravane bloodline. Territory conversion. He had never heard the name. The assessors had never recorded it. The historical ability catalogs had no entry for it. He thought about the unknown mineral composition and deep vein formations that the survey from 230 years ago had noted briefly and never followed up on. He thought about 6 failed settlement attempts in 200 years. He thought about the council chamber and Lord Harren's specific warmth and the chair that was positioned slightly below eye level. He thought about 23 people who had followed him into a wasteland and held a perimeter through the night. He called the group together. They came in the morning light, tired and marked and present. Soren and Bram. The 8 soldiers. The 12 settlers. 23 people standing in a corrupted wasteland on the Empire's northeastern frontier, looking at the person who had brought them here. He said he had something to tell them. He said his bloodline had awakened. The reactions were varied in the way that reactions always were when a group received significant information simultaneously. Some of the soldiers looked relieved in the uncomplicated way of people who had been following someone without bloodline ability and had been waiting for that to change. Some of the settlers looked cautious, the way people looked when they had been given reasons to be careful about information that sounded good. Soren looked at him with an expression that was not surprise and not relief but the specific expression of someone whose assessment of a situation has just been confirmed. Bram said, "What is it?" Kale said it was a territory conversion bloodline. He said what that meant in practical terms was that every monster killed in the territory contributed to a restoration process that was already active and visible within 5 meters of where he was standing. He pointed at the ground within the radius. Several people looked. Several of them crouched and touched the soil the way he had. Several of them looked up at him. One of the settlers, a woman named Aline who had been a farmer before the overtaxation of her district had made farming in place untenable, put her hand flat on the soil within the radius and then moved her hand to the soil outside the radius and then back inside and looked at Kale with an expression that was not the relief of the soldiers or the caution of the other settlers but something more specific. She said, "The soil inside is different." He said, "Yes." She said, "The corruption is less." He said, "Yes." She said, "How wide will the radius get?" He said he did not know the final range. He said the radius grew as the bloodline advanced and the bloodline advanced through absorption of monster cores and through the conversion of kills within the recognized territory. He said the territory recognition range was currently 5 meters. He said it would not always be 5 meters. She looked at the wasteland around them, the dark corrupted soil extending in every direction beyond the small circle of slightly restored ground around Kale, and then she looked back at him with the specific expression of someone who has just done a calculation and arrived at a number that changes their understanding of their situation. She said, "Every monster we kill in the territory feeds into your bloodline." He said, "Yes." She said, "And the bloodline feeds into the land." He said, "Yes." She said, "So the monsters that come to kill us are also the thing that makes the land recover." He said, "Yes." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That is the most backwards thing I have ever heard and I think it is going to work." Several people laughed. Not the relieved laughter of tension releasing, the genuine laughter of people who have just had the situation reframed in a way that makes it absurd and real simultaneously. Kale waited for the laughter to settle. He said he needed them to understand the full picture before they decided anything. He said the territory was going to be harder before it was easier. The restoration process was beginning, but it was beginning from a position that was extremely depleted, and the progress in the early stages was going to be slow, and the monsters were not going to stop because the land was slowly recovering. He said the perimeter they had held last night was going to need to be held every night for the foreseeable future, and the perimeter was going to expand as the restoration radius expanded, which meant the engagement range was going to expand before the settlement was large enough to hold the expanded range comfortably. He said he was not going to tell them it was going to be safe. He said he was going to tell them it was going to be productive. There was a difference and he thought they deserved to know the difference clearly. Soren said from the back of the group that in his experience a situation that was productive was better than a situation that was safe and unproductive, and that he had made his decision and it remained his decision. Several of the soldiers said similar things in the direct language of people who had decided and were not interested in revisiting the decision. The settlers took longer. That was appropriate. The soldiers had committed to following where they were directed. The settlers had committed to a territory that had just revealed itself as more difficult than the council's description had suggested. They had a different kind of stake. Aline spoke for them. She said they had come because staying in the city was also a kind of dying, a slower one. She said what Kale had just described was a different kind of dying if they stayed until the situation became untenable, or a different kind of living if it became what his bloodline suggested it could become. She said the 12 of them would stay and work, and they asked one thing in return. Kale said, name it. She said, be honest with us the way you were honest just now. All the way through. When it gets worse and when it gets better. No counsel warmth. Just the actual situation. Kale said yes. He said that was the only way he knew how to operate. She looked at him for a moment. Then she said good. She said she had had enough of counsel warmth to last several lifetimes. He organized the morning. The first priority was the defensive perimeter, reinforcing the camp structures that the night's engagements had stressed. The second priority was mapping the immediate territory, understanding the terrain within the movement range they were going to need to operate in. The third priority was the monster core processing, understanding what the absorption range meant in practical terms and beginning to develop the protocols for maximizing the territory recognition function. He worked through all three priorities simultaneously because waiting for one to be complete before beginning the next was a luxury that the territory's condition did not offer. By midday the camp perimeter was reinforced. By mid-afternoon the mapping team had returned with terrain information that was consistent with what the historical records had suggested: corrupted soil throughout the accessible range, no visible fresh water sources within the first kilometer, the ruins of the previous settlement visible to the southeast. By late afternoon Kale had walked the full extent of the current 5-meter territory recognition radius and had felt the bloodline function respond to the proximity of the kill sites from the previous night, the 20% conversion of the 12 kills already being processed through the system. He stood at the edge of the recognition radius and felt the bloodline working, not dramatically. Not in the way of an ability that announced itself. Quietly, continuously, at the pace of something that was going to compound rather than spike. The 5-meter circle of slightly restored soil was marginally different than it had been this morning. Not visible in the way that Aline had detected it with her hands. Visible only to him, through the bloodline, through the specific awareness that territory conversion produced in its holder. The land was responding. It was responding slowly. It was responding in increments that were not yet meaningful on any practical agricultural or structural timeline. But it was responding, which was something the territory had not done for 200 years regardless of who was standing in it. He stayed at the edge of the radius for a while. He thought about the noble council and their warmth and the chair position slightly below eye level. He thought about 4 assessors and 4 results and 4 years of dormant classification. He thought about his father's silence after the 4th assessment and his older brother's bloodline and his sister's rare ability and the specific texture of being in a family where you were the person without the thing that everyone else had. He thought about 23 people who had crossed a corrupted boundary with him and held a perimeter through a night of monster attacks and were still here in the afternoon light going about the work of building something. He did not feel triumphant. He felt the particular quality of someone who has identified the right problem to be working on and has started working on it. Not certainty. Not the premature satisfaction of a conclusion. The steadier and more sustainable feeling of someone who is at the beginning of the right work rather than anywhere near the end of it. The monsters would come tonight. He would collect the cores. The territory would respond. And the Empire of Valdren, which had looked at Kale Dreven's dormant bloodline assessment and seen a second son without value and awarded him a wasteland as a polite method of disposal, would continue for some time yet to be unaware that what they had discarded was not what they thought it was. That was all right. He had time. He walked back to the camp and returned to the work. The second night was harder than the first. Not because the monsters were stronger, though some of them were, but because the people holding the perimeter were carrying the first night in their bodies. Tired in the specific way of people who had been in sustained alertness for hours and had not had enough recovery time before the next sustained alertness began. Muscle fatigue and the particular mental tiredness of people who had been making fast decisions in dangerous conditions and were now being asked to make them again before the reset that genuine sleep would have provided. Kale had anticipated this. During the afternoon he had organized the group into 2 watches. Not the standard military rotation of alternating halves, but a layered system where the first watch was the more experienced fighters, Soren and Bram, and 4 of the soldiers, who would hold the perimeter through the first portion of the night, while the second watch, the remaining 4 soldiers and 2 of the settlers who had confirmed combat backgrounds, rested in genuine sleep rather than light doze. The rotation happened at the midpoint of the night rather than at the point where most attacks occurred, which was the early hours rather than the middle, based on the pattern Kale had observed the previous night. The system worked. The attacks came in the early hours as anticipated. 7 monsters in the first wave, a larger number than the previous night's opening, and then a gap, and then 4 more, and then silence until near dawn when 2 more came from the north in the same pattern as the final attack of the first night, the slightly coordinated approach from the unexpected angle. The perimeter held. When the sun came up again the group was intact. 13 monster cores from the second night added to the 12 from the first. 25 cores in 2 nights. Kale collected them all and absorbed them standing at the camp center in the morning light, and the bloodline registered each one with the same warmth and the same pulse of dissolution, and the territory recognition radius expanded again by the increment that 25 total cores produced. The radius was approximately 6 meters now. He walked it after the morning briefing. 6 meters in a corrupted wasteland was not large enough to build anything inside. It was not large enough to plant anything inside. It was not large enough to matter in any of the ways that territory mattered to the people who administered it in the Empire's framework. But it was larger than 5 meters had been, and 5 meters had been larger than nothing, and nothing was where they had started 2 days ago. He told the group the radius measurement during the morning briefing. Aline asked how large it needed to be before the soil within it was workable for planting. Kale said the corruption removal was progressive. It was not a binary shift from corrupted to usable. The soil within the current radius was less corrupted than it had been, but it was not yet at the threshold where standard seed germination would succeed. He said based on the rate of change he was observing through the bloodline the soil within the radius would reach basic planting threshold when the corruption had been reduced to approximately 30% of its current level. He said he was estimating that threshold at roughly 4 to 6 weeks of current absorption rate. Aline did the math visibly, the way experienced farmers did math, with the body rather than just the mind. She said the absorption rate depended on the number of monster kills in the territory each night. He said yes. She said so we need the monsters to keep coming. He said yes. She made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and an acknowledgement and said she had never in her life been in a situation where more monster attacks was the productive outcome. She said she was going to need some time to adjust her relationship to that information. Several people laughed. The laughter was briefer than it had been yesterday. Not because the situation was worse but because the group was settling into the reality of what this territory was going to require from them, and laughter in that context was a shorter thing, the kind that punctuated work rather than interrupted it. He organized the 3rd day. The mapping team went further on the 3rd day than they had been able to go on the 2nd, covering more of the northeastern and eastern sections of the territory. They came back with information about the terrain that confirmed several things Kale had anticipated from the historical records and added one thing he had not. Soren delivered the mapping report in the late afternoon while the settlers were handling the camp maintenance tasks. He said the northeastern section was consistent with the records. Heavy corruption throughout. No viable water sources visible on the surface. Monster sign throughout the mapped area. Tracks and territorial marking patterns consistent with a population significantly larger than the 12 that had attacked the previous 2 nights. The eastern section was similar. Dense corruption, no surface water, significant monster activity indicators. Then he said there was a formation in the southeastern section that the mapping team had not been able to fully assess but that did not match the surrounding terrain. Kale asked him to describe it. Soren said it was a depression in the land rather than an elevation. Roughly circular. Approximately 40 meters across. The ground around the depression was the standard corrupted soil, but the depression itself was different, darker even than the surrounding corruption, the specific quality of something that had been the center of concentrated activity for a very long time. He said the mapping team had not gone into the depression because the monster sign around it was significantly heavier than in the surrounding area, the kind of concentration that indicated territorial claiming rather than random passage. He said there was something in it. Cale thought about the survey from 230 years ago. The unknown mineral composition and deep vein formations. He thought about the corrupted territory and the 6 failed settlement attempts and the specific decision by someone 200 years ago to corrupt this territory deliberately. If you were going to corrupt a territory to hide something, the thing you were hiding would be at the center of the corruption. He said he needed to see the depression. Soren said he had anticipated that and had kept the mapping team ready to guide him. They went the following morning, Cale and Soren and 2 of the soldiers. The southeastern section was a 40-minute walk from the camp at the pace that the terrain allowed. The corruption in this section was visually heavier than the area around the camp, the soil darker and the air carrying more of the wrong quality that the territory had in general, but concentrated. The way a flavor became stronger the closer you got to its source. The depression was exactly as Soren had described. 40 meters across. Circular in a way that was too consistent to be natural erosion, the specific symmetry of something that had been created rather than formed. The edges of the depression were defined by a rim of stone that was partially buried by the accumulated debris of 2 centuries but still visible, the original boundary marker of whatever had been here before the corruption. The interior of the depression was darker than anything else in the territory. Not the soil color of standard corruption. Something more absolute than that, the specific darkness of a place that had been at the center of concentrated corruption for 200 years and had absorbed it all. Cale stood at the rim and felt his bloodline respond. Not in the way it responded to a core. The warmth that the core absorption produced was brief and specific, a discrete event. What the bloodline was doing at the depression rim was continuous and directional, like a compass needle pointing rather than like a pulse arriving. The territory conversion function was registering something in the depression with a quality of attention it had not given to any other feature of the territory. He looked at the stone rim under his feet. He crouched and cleared some of the accumulated debris from the nearest section of the stone with his hands, brushing it away until the surface of the stone was visible. The stone had markings on it. Not natural. Carved. The carvings were old enough that the edges had softened and in some places were barely distinguishable from the surface, but they were there. He traced one with his finger. The bloodline responded to the contact. Not dramatically. A brief additional warmth, different in quality from the core absorption warmth, more specific, the warmth of recognition rather than acquisition. Like the bloodline knew the markings. Like the markings and the bloodline were part of the same original design. He sat back on his heels and thought about the Terravane bloodline classification the system had shown him on the first morning. Terravane. He had never heard the name before. The assessors had never recorded it. The historical ability catalogs had no entry for it. A bloodline that had been dormant for 4 assessments over 4 years was a bloodline that had been dormant for a long time before the assessors ever arrived to check. If the bloodline had been dormant long enough, the people who carried it might not have known what they were carrying, might have passed it from generation to generation as a latent trait with no active expression, and over enough generations the knowledge of what it was and what it had been designed for would have faded along with the ability to activate it. His family had no record of the Terravane bloodline in their history. But his family had also never had anyone in it who ended up in a territory with corrupted soil and monster cores to absorb. He looked at the carved markings on the stone rim. He thought about the word designed. The system had shown him the bloodline classification and the functions and the unlocking conditions, and the way it was written was not the way naturally occurring abilities were documented in the Empire's records. Natural abilities described what the ability did. The Terravane description described what the ability was for: territory restoration energy, corruption removal, mineral unlocking, the secondary function that was locked and waiting for a bloodline advancement threshold. These were not the descriptions of an accident, they were the descriptions of a tool. Something that had been made to do a specific job in a specific place, that he had been put in this place by people who thought they were disposing of him. That he stood up and looked at the depression. He said to Soren that they would not be going into the depression yet. Soren said he had not expected they would be. Kale said the monster concentration around it was not random, something in the depression was attracting them. The corruption in the depression was the heaviest concentration in the territory, and heavy corruption attracted monsters in the way that accumulated resources attracted predators. The depression was functionally a monster territory center, and approaching it without preparation was the kind of decision that produced the outcomes the previous 6 settlement attempts had ended with. Soren said, what did preparation look like? Kale said preparation looked like expanding the territory recognition radius to cover the area between the camp and the depression, and building a defensive path through the mapped sections before attempting to approach the depression directly. He said it also looked like the group being stronger than it currently was, which was a function of time and absorption and the work they were already doing. He said they were not ready yet. Soren said, how long? Kale said he did not know exactly. He said the bloodline advancement was continuous rather than discrete, meaning it was not a system that jumped from one level to the next in single steps, but one that grew progressively, and the rate of growth depended on the absorption rate, which depended on the monster kill rate, which was going to increase as the territory recognition radius expanded and more of the territory's monster population fell within the 20% conversion range. He said it would happen faster than it would have if they had come here with a full garrison and cleared the area through conventional force and never triggered the bloodline at all. Soren said that was not something he would have expected to say about being understaffed in a wasteland. Kale said most productive things were not obvious from the outside. They walked back to camp. That night was different. Not in the number of monsters or the attack pattern or the outcome of the engagement. In something that happened during the middle period of the night, when the first watch was at the perimeter and the second watch was in rest rotation. Kale was at the edge of the territory recognition radius, which he had made a habit of standing at during the perimeter quiet periods, feeling the bloodline's continuous work and monitoring the rate of change, when the bloodline showed him something new. Not a system notification in the way the initial awakening had been a notification. More like a sense expanding, the way your eyes adjusted to darkness and let you see things that had been invisible in the first moment. The territory recognition radius was currently 6 meters from him. The bloodline's 20% conversion function was active within that radius for kills by his people. But there was a different kind of awareness beginning to develop at the edges of the radius, a faint extension of the sense that was not the solid conversion radius but something more diffuse. He stood still and paid attention to it. Monsters in the surrounding territory. He could feel them the way you could feel movement in water you were standing in, not seeing them but registering their presence through the medium that connected them to the thing he was standing in. The territory itself. The land that was in the process of changing was also in the process of becoming something he had a sense of, not sight exactly, a territorial awareness that was developing alongside the conversion function. He could feel 3 monsters approaching from the east. Not seeing them. Feeling them through the land, the specific disturbance of corrupted soil that something moving across it produced, registering through the bloodline's connection to the territory the same way vibration registered through a medium it was passing through. He went to Soren at the eastern perimeter. He said 3 from the east, approximately 200 meters, moving at patrol pace rather than attack pace. Soren looked at him. He said, how do you know? Kale said the bloodline was developing a territorial sense. He said he was not certain of the accuracy yet and he wanted Soren to verify with conventional observation before acting on the information. Soren positioned himself to observe the eastern approach without alerting whatever was coming. 2 minutes later he came back. He said 3. He said 200 meters had been accurate. He said they were moving the way things moved when they were covering ground rather than closing on a target, which matched patrol pace. Kale said he would tell him when the movement changed. They waited. For minutes later the bloodline registered the shift. The movement pattern changed from the steady ground covering pace to something with more direction, more purpose, the specific change from browsing to hunting. He told Soren. Soren alerted the perimeter. The three monsters came from the eastern approach 30 seconds later and the perimeter was ready for them. Clean engagement. All three down. 3 more cores. Soren came to stand beside Kale after the cores were collected. He said that was useful. Kale said it was going to become more useful as the radius expanded. He said the territorial sense appeared to extend beyond the conversion radius, which meant it would be an early warning system for approaches that were outside the area of direct bloodline function. Soren said how far did it extend currently? Kale said approximately 200 meters. He said he did not know yet whether that was a fixed extension or whether it scaled with the conversion radius. Soren said if it scaled with the conversion radius and the conversion radius could cover the territory's full extent, then they would effectively have a complete awareness of everything moving in the territory at all times. Kale said yes. Soren was quiet for a moment. Then he said he had spent 30 years as a guardian knight for a family whose bloodline moved stone with their hands, and he had thought he understood what bloodline abilities looked like. He said he had been wrong about that. Kale said most people were wrong about it because the Empire's ability catalog was built around combat output and the Terravane bloodline did not produce combat output. Soren said what did it produce? Kale said a kingdom. Eventually. If they did the work. Soren looked at him. He said eventually was doing a lot of work in that sentence. Kale said yes. He said eventually always did the most work in any sentence about building something from nothing. He said that was the nature of starting at the beginning. Soren said he was going to return to his perimeter position. Kale said that was good. The night finished without further engagement. In the morning of the third day Aline came to him while he was reviewing the mapping information. She said she had been thinking about the soil threshold he had described, the point at which the corruption within the restoration radius would be reduced enough for basic planting. She said 4 to 6 weeks was based on the current absorption rate. She said the current absorption rate was based on the monster population that was coming to them rather than the population they were going out to engage. She said if they went out to engage instead of waiting to be engaged, the absorption rate would go up. He looked at her. She said she understood that going out to engage meant increased risk to the people doing the engaging. She said she was not minimizing that. She was presenting the calculation because she thought he should have all the information when he was making decisions about rate and timeline, and she did not know if he had considered the proactive engagement option. He said he had considered it. He said the constraint was not willingness. The constraint was the ratio of engagement difficulty to available combat capacity. The territory's monster population was larger than what had been coming to the perimeter each night. The nighttime attacks were the territory's natural predator behavior, the monsters responding to the presence of the camp. Proactive daytime engagement would encounter the full population rather than the portion of it that came on their own initiative, and the full population was beyond the current group's safe engagement capacity. He said as the group grew stronger, as the absorption increased the bloodline's functions and as the territory recognition radius expanded to provide better early warning and more controlled engagement conditions, proactive hunting would become viable. She said so there is a point where we go from them coming to us going to them. He said yes. She said that changes the rate significantly. He said significantly was the right word. She nodded once, the nod of someone who has received the information they needed and is now going back to the work they were already doing with the additional context incorporated. He found himself noting her quality of thinking the same way he noted terrain features during mapping, as something that had value and utility and deserved to be used well rather than left where it happened to be. On the fourth day 2 things happened. The first was that a family arrived at the territory boundary. Not from the direction of the imperial capital. From the west, from the direction of the outer agricultural territories that bordered the Empire's managed zones. A man and a woman and 3 children, the oldest perhaps 12, the youngest perhaps 4. They arrived at the boundary posts with a cart and 2 tired horses and the specific quality of people who had been traveling for long enough that stopping was not a luxury but a necessity, and they had stopped at the first place that looked like it might be a stopping place. The man's name was Ivo. He said they had been traveling for 11 days from the Garland agricultural territory where his family had farmed for 3 generations until the territory tax assessment had been revised upward for the second consecutive year to a level where the farming income no longer covered the tax obligation. He said they had been told there was a pioneer settlement in the northeastern frontier and they had come to see if it was real. Cale looked at him. Then at the woman, who had the patient exhausted quality of someone who had made a very difficult decision and was going to live inside that decision with full commitment regardless of what they found at the end of it. Then at the 3 children, who were watching him with the direct attention of children who had not yet learned to perform indifference. He said the settlement was real and it was in early stages and it was not safe in the way that established settlements were safe. Ivo said their options were limited. Cale said he understood that. He looked at the family for a moment. He said the territory was in the process of restoration. He said the soil within the current restoration radius was not yet at planting threshold but would reach it within the month. He said the work was hard and the nights were dangerous and they would be expected to contribute to both the defense and the building of the settlement in whatever capacity their skills and condition allowed. He said what he could offer in return was a share of the territory's resources as it developed, real stake in what was being built rather than a conditional arrangement that could be revised when it became convenient. He said that was what everyone in the settlement had been offered and what everyone in it had accepted. Ivo looked at his wife. His wife looked at Cale. She said what was the soil like within the restoration radius? He said come and look. They came and looked. She put her hand flat on the soil within the radius and kept it there for several seconds with the focused attention of someone doing an assessment rather than just touching something. She moved her hand outside the radius and back in. She looked at the difference with the professional attention of a person who had spent a lifetime understanding soil. She looked at her husband. She said it's coming back. Ivo looked at Cale. He said they would stay. The second thing that happened on the 4th day was that one of the soldiers, a young man named Pell who was 19 and had the build of someone who had grown up doing physical labor before he had ever thought about military service, came to Cale in the afternoon with a question. He said he had been thinking about the bloodline function. The 20% conversion from territory kills. Cale said yes. Pell said that meant every monster he killed in the territory added to the bloodline absorption. Cale said yes. Pell said so his fighting was directly improving the territory. Cale said yes. Pell was quiet for a moment with the expression of someone turning an idea around to see all its sides. He said it felt different knowing that. Cale asked him to explain what he meant. Pell said at home, before the military service, the work he did on his family's property felt like it was building something. Every day of work added to something that was there the next day and the next. When he had joined the military the work had felt different. Necessary but not cumulative. You fought to hold what was there, not to build something new. He said the perimeter fighting here felt the same as the building work back home. Every monster he took down was not just holding what existed. It was adding to something. He said he just wanted Cale to know that. Cale said he appreciated it. Pell went back to his work. Cale stood where he was for a moment after Pell left and thought about what Pell had said. Not the sentiment of it, though the sentiment was real and he registered it. The structural fact of it. People worked differently when the work was cumulative. When the outcome of what they did today was visible in the condition of what existed tomorrow. The group he had been organizing for 4 days was organized around tasks and roles and survival imperatives, which were all necessary. But underneath all of that there was a layer of motivation that was not about task completion but about what the task was building toward. If every person in the settlement understood that their specific contribution was feeding into something they could see change, the quality of the contribution would be different. He went to the evening briefing with this in his thinking. The evening briefing was something he had established from the first day, a daily gathering of the full group before the night watch rotation began. He used it to share information about the territory status, the absorption numbers, the restoration radius measurement, the mapping results, anything that bore on the situation they were all living inside. He had done this because information management in a group was a force multiplier. People who understood the situation made better decisions within it. People who did not understand the situation defaulted to assumption, and assumption in a contested frontier territory was the thing that produced avoidable deaths. At the fourth day's briefing he added something that he told the group: the current restoration radius measurement. He told them the current absorption total. He told them how many core equivalents they were from the next measurable threshold of soil recovery. Then he told them the number that represented their personal contribution. He had calculated it. The 20% conversion applied to the territory kills meant that the 8 soldiers who had been fighting every night had each contributed a specific number of core equivalents to the absorption total. He told each of them their number. Not publicly, not in front of the group, but individually after the briefing, going to each person and telling them what their specific work had added to the territory's recovery. He did the same for the settlers. Their contribution was different, building and maintaining the camp structures that made the perimeter function, but it was measurable in the same framework. Every structure they completed increased the defensive efficiency of the perimeter engagement, which increased the survival rate of the fighters, which increased the kill rate, which increased the absorption. Their contribution was in the chain, not at the end of it, but they were in the chain, and he told them that. He told Soren and Bram their numbers. He told Ivo and his wife, who had arrived that morning and had already spent the afternoon working on the camp structures, that they were in the chain too. He told them what their afternoon's work had already added. He went to each person in the group of now 25 and told them their number. The evening after he did this was different from the evenings before it. He could not have quantified the difference precisely. The work was the same. The perimeter was the same. The night had the same darkness and the same corrupted air and the same monsters that came at the same intervals with the same attack patterns the territory had been producing for 4 days. But the people holding the perimeter held it differently. Not harder. Not more desperately or with more fear or with more force. With more presence. The specific quality of people who understood that what they were doing in the moment they were doing it was building directly into something they were going to be able to see change. Kale stood at the center of the camp in the night's quiet periods and felt the bloodline working and watched his people and thought about the difference between a group of 23 individuals who had come to a wasteland with nowhere else to go and what they were becoming. The second thing that changed on the 5th night was the monster behavior. He registered it through the territorial sense before any of the perimeter fighters could have seen it. The attack pattern was different from what the first 4 nights had produced. Not in the number or the direction of approach but in the timing. The attacks were spaced differently, the intervals between them shorter in a way that was not random variation but a systematic compression, as if the territory's monster population was responding to something that had changed in the environment and was increasing its pressure in response. He thought about what had changed. The restoration radius had expanded. Not dramatically. The 6-meter radius of the first morning had grown over 4 days of absorption to approximately 9 meters. 9 meters was not large. But it was large enough to register as a change in the territory's corruption profile, and the territory's corruption profile was the environment that the monster population had been calibrated to. Corruption was not just a condition of the soil. It was the resource base that the territory's monsters depended on, the corrupted land producing the conditions that their specific biology required. Restoration was, from the monster population's perspective, the reduction of their habitat. They were not attacking more because they had become more aggressive. They were attacking more because the territory was changing and the change was not in their favor. He stood in the camp center with this understanding and felt the weight of it settle into his planning. The monster pressure was going to increase as the restoration accelerated. The more the bloodline worked, the more the monsters would respond to the working. The relationship between restoration and monster pressure was not linear. It was a feedback loop. Restore more, face more attacks, absorb more cores from the attacks, restore faster, face more attacks. The loop would accelerate in both directions simultaneously. That was going to require the settlement to grow in defensive capacity at least as fast as the restoration grew in scope. He went to Soren after the first engagement of the fifth night. He said the attack frequency was going to increase as the restoration progressed. He said the increase was not a sign that things were going wrong. It was a sign that things were going right in a way that the territory's monster population was responding to. But responding to it correctly required the settlement's defensive capacity to scale with the restoration rate rather than staying at its current level. Soren said the current defensive capacity was 8 soldiers and 2 knights for a perimeter that would need to be significantly larger as the radius expanded. Kale said yes. Soren said that was not enough. Kale said no. He said it was not enough now and it was going to be further from enough as the restoration continued. He said this was the thing he had not been able to solve before arrival because the solution depended on variables he could not have known before he was here. Soren said what was the solution? Kale said the settlement needed more people. Not just more settlers for the agricultural and building work. People with combat capacity, with ability, or training or both, who were willing to come to a frontier territory with an unusual lord who had no conventional standing in the Empire's ability hierarchy. Soren said where were these people going to come from? Kale said the same place the existing settlers had come from. The Empire was full of people the system had discarded, people with low-rank abilities the guild had assessed as insufficient, people who had lost standing through the kind of institutional decisions that the people making them did not have to live with afterward. The frontier territory of a lord without conventional standing was not going to attract people with options. But people without options were not the same as people without capacity. He had seen that in the existing group already. Aline with her agricultural knowledge that had made her the most useful person in the settlement for the restoration timeline. Hell with his understanding of what cumulative work felt like. Evo's wife whose hands had read the soil recovery in 30 seconds and made a decision based on what they read. The Empire's system measured specific things and missed everything that did not fit its measurement framework. The Wasteland was full of people the system had missed. Soren said the territory's reputation was going to be a barrier. People came to frontier territories for opportunities, and the opportunity in a contested wasteland was not obvious. Kale said word was going to travel. It always did. The family that had arrived on the 4th day had heard about the settlement from someone who had heard about it from somewhere. He said the word that traveled currently was that there was a settlement in the northeastern wasteland that had survived its first week. He said the word that would travel in 2 weeks was that the settlement had survived its second week. He said the word that would travel in a month was that the settlement's soil was changing and things were growing in it. He said word traveled at the speed of the thing it was reporting on and the thing it was reporting on was going to keep changing. Soren said he hoped Kale was right about that. Kale said he did too. The 5th night finished with more cores than the 4 nights before it combined. The increased attack frequency had produced increased absorption and the restoration radius had expanded more in a single night than it had in the previous 4 combined. He was standing at the edge of the expanded radius in the early morning light, feeling the Bloodline's continuous work, when he noticed something he had not seen before. The boundary of the radius was visible. Not to the Bloodline sense. To the eye. On one side of the boundary the soil was the corrupted dark of the territory's baseline. On the other side the soil was different enough in color and texture that the line between them was visible from standing height. Not a dramatic line, not a clean edge, but a gradient that was steep enough to see. 8 days of progressive restoration had produced a visible difference in the soil within the radius and the soil outside it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he called the group out to look at it. They came. All of them, the soldiers ending their watch rotations, the settlers coming out of the camp structures, Evo's family emerging from the temporary shelter they had been given. They gathered at the edge of the radius and looked at the visible line between the corrupted territory and the section of it that was in the process of becoming something different. Nobody said anything for a moment. The visible line was not large. The radius was 11 meters now after the previous night's expanded absorption. 22 meters of diameter, roughly the size of a large house and its immediate grounds, lighter than its surroundings, sitting in the middle of a corrupted wasteland like a circle of something that was in the process of returning to itself. Aline crouched at the line and put one hand in each soil and held the comparison. She looked up at Kale. She said 6 more days. He said to planting threshold. She said yes. She said maybe less if the rate kept accelerating the way it had last night. She said the soil on the inner side of the line was close. Not there yet but close. She said she could feel the difference and farmers knew what close meant. He looked at the circle of recovering soil in the middle of the wasteland and thought about the noble council and the warmth and the chair position below eye level. He thought about what the council had sent him here to do, which was to disappear into a territory that had killed every previous attempt at settlement and to do it quietly and without making any claims on the Empire's attention or resources. He thought about what he was actually doing, which was standing in the same territory looking at soil that was changing because of his bloodline and watching people who had followed him here finding purpose in the work of changing it. Pell came to stand beside him. He said my number went up again last night. Kale said yes. Pell said it went up more than it has any previous night. Kale said the attack frequency increased. Pell said so more attacks meant more kills and more kills meant higher contribution numbers. Kale said yes. Pell looked at the visible line between the corrupted and recovering soil. He said so that is also my number. Kale said yes. He said every person standing around the radius boundary was looking at their number. The circle of recovering soil was not an abstract measurement. It was the accumulated contribution of everyone in the settlement since the first night, rendered visible in the land itself. Pell looked at it for another moment. Then he said to his nearest neighbor, one of the other young soldiers, that they needed to go kill more monsters tonight. The other soldier said obviously. They went back to work. Kale stayed at the boundary for a while longer that he thought about the secondary function that was locked and waiting for the bloodline advancement threshold. He thought about the depression in the southeastern section with its 200-year-old corruption and the carved stone rim that the bloodline had recognized. He thought about the deep vein formations that the 230-year-old survey had noted briefly and never followed up on. He thought about the word designed. The tool that the Terravane bloodline was. The job it had been built to do in a specific place. He was in that place. He was doing that job. He did not know yet what was at the center of the depression. He did not know yet what the secondary function would be when it unlocked. He did not know yet what the deep vein formations contained or what the carved markings on the stone rim meant or what the noble council had been trying to bury when they corrupted this territory 200 years ago. He knew that the soil was changing. He knew that 25 people who had come to a wasteland for different reasons had spent 8 days building something together and were now standing at the edge of what they had built and finding that what they had built was visible. He knew that the word was traveling and that what it would say in 1 week would be different from what it said today and that what it said in 1 month would be different again and that by the time the noble council's attention turned back to this territory, which it would, the thing it found here would not be what it had been designed to find. That was enough to work with. He went back to the camp and returned to the work. The 9th day began the same way every day had begun since the first morning. With the territory recognition radius slightly larger than it had been the day before, the corrupted soil within it slightly less corrupted, and the people in the settlement slightly more certain than they had been the previous morning that what they were building was real. That was how it always worked, not in dramatic steps, not in single moments of transformation. In the accumulation of daily increments that individually meant almost nothing and collectively meant everything that he had known that before he came here, now the people who had come with him knew it too. And in the evening of the 9th day, 3 more people arrived at the territory boundary from the southwestern direction, 2 of them with the low-rank ability classification patches on their jackets that the Empire's guild system issued to people it had assessed and declined to develop further, and 1 of them without a patch at all, which meant either no ability or an assessment that had not been completed. They stood at the boundary posts and looked at the settlement visible in the middle distance. Kale walked out to meet them. He asked them what had brought them. The one without the patch, a woman in her 30s with the direct eyes of someone who had been making her own decisions for long enough that the habit was permanent, said they had heard there was a settlement here that was doing something with the land. He said that was accurate. She said they had heard the lord of the settlement had no conventional bloodline ability. He said that had been accurate. He said his bloodline had awakened since arriving. She looked at the patch-wearing members of her group and then back at him. She said what kind of bloodline? He said the kind that made the land stronger. She looked at the settlement in the middle distance. At the camp structures and the perimeter and the faint visible difference in the soil within the restoration radius that was detectable even from this distance if you knew to look for it. She looked back at him. She said they had been told their abilities were insufficient. He said he had been told his was dormant. She said that was not quite the same thing. He said no. He said it was not. But the outcome of both assessments had been the same. They had all ended up at the same boundary on the edge of the same wasteland, and the question now was not what the guild system had said about what they were but what they were willing to build with what they had. She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she looked at the two with her and they had the brief exchange of people who had already discussed the question thoroughly before arriving at the place where it needed to be answered. She looked back at Kale. She said they would stay. He said come in then. They crossed the boundary. The territory recognition radius registered the addition of 3 more people as they entered the space that the bloodline had marked as its own. 3 more people. 3 more sets of hands. 3 more contributions to the accumulation that was changing the land one increment at a time. He walked them to the camp and introduced them to Soren and Bram and told them the same things he had told the settlers on the first day and what he had told Evo's family on the 4th. The work. The danger. The contribution chain. The visible line between what the territory had been and what it was becoming. That he told them what he told everyone. No council warmth. Just the actual situation. And what the actual situation was, on the 9th day of a frontier settlement in a corrupted wasteland that the noble council had awarded to a man with a dormant bloodline classification as a polite method of disposal, was this. The land was changing. The people who were changing it were still here. And the number of them was growing. Want to see what happens next? Subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next part.